Warning: this podcast contains graphic content. Trigger warnings include descriptions of violence, torture, murder, and rape. Some episodes may include offenses against children. Please listen with caution, as this podcast is not meant for everyone. It was November 30th, 1984, when 13-year-old Candace Derksen was last seen walking home from school in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She had called to ask her mother for a ride, but her mother was busy and told her to walk. When she never made it home that evening, her family was hoping that she had run away and was trying to teach them a lesson. But as the days passed, her sudden and unexplained vanishing set off a wave of fear and uncertainty in the community. 7 weeks after Candace disappeared, her frozen and bound body was found in a shed less than 500 meters from her house. Let's retrace the events leading up to Candace's disappearance, examine the twists and turns of the investigation, and uncover the unexpected conclusion to this haunting case. This is Candace's story. Grab your favorite mug, pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee, and join me as we dive into this mysterious case. I'm Shanda, and every week I'll take you through a deep dive into the dark shadows of true crime while sipping on a cup of joe. So today's Thursday, obviously. Happy Thursday, guys! There's 6 sleeps now until Christmas, and I will be posting next week, although it just might be a shorter episode. This case came to me in a really cool way, I guess. I had been researching a few different cases, including this one, and I was trying to find a case with enough information to create a full episode, because apparently it's harder than you think. And so there were about 4 different ones that I was deciding on, and then I went to work and the radio was on, and it's not normal for me to have the radio on. I always hook up to Bluetooth. I'm playing either a podcast or music on Spotify. And so anyway, I'm driving to work, and all of a sudden I hear the host announce whatever she was announcing. I think it was crime or something, and she said her name was Candace Derksen, and I instantly knew I had to cover this case. So that's who we are covering this week. This is Missing, Murdered, and Macchiatos. Candace Derksen was born on July 6, 1971, to Wilma and Cliff Derksen. She grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with her younger brother Cyrus and younger sister Odia. The family were active members of the Mennonite religion, and Candace was known for being a social butterfly and creating a space of acceptance and joy. In middle school, the teachers would often sit her beside the so-called bullies to create a more welcoming and calm environment. Candace loved swimming, horseback riding, and her friends. On November 30th, 1984, 13-year-old Candace attended her grade 7 class at Mennonite Brethren Collegiate Institute on Talbot Avenue in Winnipeg. When school had finished, Candace and her school crush named David had a snowball fight outside. After they had finished the snowball fight, she had mentioned looking for a ride home, but David didn't have his vehicle. David apologized to Candace, to which she replied that it wasn't a big deal, she would just walk home. When they went their separate ways, Candace walked to the store near her school. Around 4:15 p.m., she called her mother Wilma to ask for a ride home, but Wilma said that she couldn't come get Candace and that she would have to walk home. Wilma could tell that Candace felt uneasy about having to walk home, so Wilma promised that she would take Candace shopping later. The walk home would normally take Candace only about 15 minutes, so when Candace hadn't showed up that evening, Wilma decided that she would contact the local police, hoping that she would return soon, but also wanting to be on the safe side and get ahead of things in case something did go wrong, as Candace had never done anything like this before. But there was always a first. Wilma was hoping Candace was just mad at her for making her walk, and she ran away to a friend's house. The community put together a search party to look for Candace. They searched everywhere between her house and the school, as well as down by the river and the railway tracks. But there were no signs of Candace, and she never returned home that evening. 48 hours into Candace's disappearance, she had missed plans of her best friend Heidi Harms coming to visit on Saturday, December 1st, even though she was so excited to see her. That day, police announced that they did not suspect foul play and were certain that she would show up to school Monday morning. On December 2nd, a witness couple came forward to a newspaper stating that they had seen Candace in Elmwood being dragged away from a bus stop on Watts Street by two teens around 4 p.m. on November 30th. This seems quite inappropriate that two grown adults had watched Candace get dragged, and they didn't go out to see what was going on, provide help, or report it to police immediately. In the article, they had said that it was definitely Candace because she was wearing a black jacket with purple sleeves. This bus stop is off of Candace's normal route, but it was close enough. On December 7th, detectives tell the public that they had spoken with the witnesses who came forward about the bus stop incident. However, the couple told police that they had not been able to say for sure it was Candace, and that it was an inappropriate media release. 2 weeks after Candace went missing, Wilma and Cliff were starting to worry that Candace might not be alive anymore. Candace had been registered with Child Find Canada, which this is right from the website. Quote, Child Find focuses on prevention, education, and location, advocates for the protection and rights of children and youth, operates a toll-free hotline for tips on missing children, produces and distributes brochures and booklets on child safety issues, photos, and posters of missing children and youth, children and baby identification kits, cards and passports, and provides assistance in search rescue. So each province in Canada has their own designated child find organization. In Candace's case, they gave photos and information to the media as well as hired private investigators. Wilma and Cliff had been interviewed multiple times after Candace went missing, and people speculated that Candace had run away from home due to tension in the home, but her parents confirmed that everything had been good. There had been no arguments, no abuse, no tension, and Candace had never run away from home before. Weeks went by with no answer, and on January 17th, Candace had been missing for 7 weeks. At 9:30 a.m., an employee at a tile and lumber business went outside to a company's building yard to grab a saw from a shed that they had rarely used. When he walked up to the shed, he moved equipment that was leaning up against the shed. He unlocked the door, and upon opening the shed door, he saw a fully clothed and tied up teenage female. She appeared to have her hands and feet tied up with twine behind her back, and was missing a shoe. At first glance, the employee thought it was a mannequin, which is actually fairly common, as when people die, gravity forces the blood to pool in the lowest body parts, leaving the skin a waxy grayish coloring. We also don't expect to find dead bodies behind closed doors, so it took a second to register what he was seeing. Another thing to mention is that January can be the coldest month of the year in places like Manitoba, and in the 7 weeks that Candace had been missing, the temperature was regularly below minus 25 degrees Celsius, and it did get as low as minus 35 degrees Celsius for a few days. For my American followers, that is minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold as fuck, my friends. Anyhow, he sees this frozen and hog-tied teenage female upon opening the door, and he immediately leaves and runs back inside to call 911. This building was less than 500 meters from the Derksen home, so like a 5 to 8 minute walk depending on your stride. Police arrive on scene, and remember, this is 1985, so the investigation is messy. And when I say messy, I mean They allowed an officer into the shed without protective equipment and before they could photograph the body. They were touching the twine around Candace's wrists and ankles with their bare hands. To bring the evidence in, they cut it off her body and threw it into a box in the back of a police car. At this time, there was no protocols for handling evidence, so it was just a disaster. Police had confirmed that the body was 13-year-old Candace Derksen and stated that at the time they had no active leads. An autopsy found that Candace had not been sexually assaulted. Her face had been frostbitten, she was covered in dust and her jeans were soiled. She had some scratching on her knees and bruising on her lower legs, as well as swelling of her right hand. Her hands and feet were bound behind her back with twine, and the scratch marks appeared that Candace had attempted to kind of fight back. It did appear that she had died by exposure to hypothermia due to finding acetone in her urine. A few months go by, and on March 12th, the police are starting to believe that Candace's death had been the result of an innocent youthful prank gone wrong. They released to the public that there was a $5,000 reward for anyone with information leading to an arrest. The police were so confused as to why someone would just tie up a teenage girl and leave her in the shed. Since police had no suspect, they had no choice but to keep digging into the family. Cliff was given a polygraph test and passed, which officially cleared him as a person of interest. On September 6, 1985, 10 months after Candace had been abducted and murdered, a woman who was walking her dog by the railroad tracks on Chalmers Avenue around 4:25 p.m. when she heard someone in distress calling for help. She found a 12-year-old girl named Patricia tied up in a boxcar of the train. Her hands and feet were bound with a rubber cord, and a plastic bag covered her head. While the woman helped untie Patricia, she was crying and calling out for her mother. The woman then drove Patricia back home, where her brothers had arrived a few minutes later and were asking who had done this to her. Patricia was able to provide a description to the police, saying that the man was 20 to 30 years old, clean-shaven with sideburns, and wore mirrored sunglasses. When the knots were examined, it appeared to investigators that the knots found in Patricia's rubber hose were similar to the knots used to bind Candace's wrists and ankles. At the time, Patricia stated that she had been abducted around 3:50 p.m. that day while walking home from school. A man had grabbed her from behind and forced her into a vehicle, drove her out to the train tracks, dragged her into a boxcar, and told her to lie down. He then bound her wrists and ankles with a rubber-type hose, took the plastic bag she had been carrying home from school, and put it around her head before he left. This location was approximately a 30-minute walk, 2.5 kilometers or 1.5 miles from the Mennonite Brethren Collegiate Institute. This worried police and the community that there may be a serial offender running wild. After evidence was sent to the FBI for profiling, they decided that the suspect in the 12-year-old's case was described as a white male, approximately 20 to 30 years old, brown curly hair, wearing a blue plaid jacket, blue pants, and driving a small two-door car, light in color with a dark interior. They believed he was single and acting alone, and had an abnormal obsession with bondage, but was also familiar with the area, whether he lived or worked close by. For the next 16 years, the police continued to issue several pleas for the community's help, but investigators were left puzzled by the public silence and the apparent lack of motive. In 2001, an RCMP cold case unit took over the case and linked the letters YOR that had been spray painted on the shed wall that Candace had been found in to a movie titled YOR, The Hunter from the Future. In this movie, Yor finds his love interest in a cave. Police added this poorly ranked movie to a list of things this person may have been infatuated with. From what I can find, in the movie, there are no teenage girls that get tied up and left behind, nor is it anything to do with bondage. These detectives also attempted to test the twine used to bind Candace as well as hairs found at the scene, but the results were inconclusive. In 2007, the detectives dive into this case again and rename it Project Angel. The RCMP had kept the shed in evidence until DNA had advanced further. A private lab in Ontario tested several pieces of this evidence, and they had found 3 pubic hairs inside the shed, 4 hairs from the scalp that appeared to have recently been bleached, but since the follicles had degraded, they were unable to be tested. On May 16, 2007, almost 22 years after Candace's murder, a 43-year-old man named Mark Grant was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with Candace's death. Allegedly, they had linked his DNA with the DNA found on the twine used to bind Candace. It was also known that he had bleached his hair back in 1984 while running from police. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mark Grant. He had spent his life in and out of jail. As a teen, he had been charged with breaking and entering, breach of parole, forgery, fraud, escaping from custody, and being unlawfully at large. When he was 14, he sexually assaulted an undisclosed aged female and was sent to a youth detention center. His parole documents had a consistent concern for his sexual desire for young females. At the time of Candace's death, he was 21 years old, and he had been serving a sentence for breaking and entering when he escaped from custody on November 7th and wasn't located until December 7th of 1984. That was about a month where he was on the run from police and the time period where Candace went missing. When he was arrested on December 7th, he was briefly questioned about Candace, but he denied knowing anything except for what was in the media at the time. 3 years after Candace's death in 1988, he was charged as an adult for sexually assaulting another female, for which he served 18 months for. The following year after he was released, he was charged and convicted of sexually assaulting a 16-year-old female and served 4 years for that. 9 days after serving his 4-year sentence, he was accused again of sexual assault and was convicted of choking and sexually assaulting a female, for which he was sentenced 10 years for. So in 1995, Justice Perry Shulman stated, quote, "I consider Grant to be an ongoing threat to the community," unquote. In 2001, Mark confessed that he had raped a drunk female, but the attack had never been reported. After this time, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed antipsychotic medication that helped ease his delusions and hallucinations, as well as another medication to control his sexual urges. During his 10-year sentence, he had applied multiple times for parole, but it was repeatedly denied due to the concern of his reoffending. As he had not been consistently taking his medication, he was attempting suicide and refusing therapy for sexual offenders. In 2005, he was released back in Winnipeg, and the city of Winnipeg put out a community notice warning women and children about the risks of sexual violence. So in Candace's case, police were able to use mitochondrial DNA to match the hair found on the twine to Mark Grant, as his DNA was already in the system since he was a convicted sex offender. January 17, 2011, the trial starts, which is exactly 26 years after Candace's body was found. Mark Grant pleaded not guilty, and now during the trial, the jury did not get to hear about his previous convictions. The prosecution's whole argument relied on the fact that they had matched 7 of the hairs down his maternal line to Mark and his siblings. They then had to figure out which sibling was most likely to match the nature of the crime, and decided on Mark because of his past. Police then followed him until they watched him spit on the ground, to which they took that sample, matched it, and was able to get a warrant to DNA swab Mark when they brought him into custody which then confirmed the match to the 7 hairs. The medical examiner testified, finding multiple hairs on Candace's clothes, the twine, and 2 logs that were inside the shed. However, he couldn't confirm that he was wearing gloves or that the surfaces in the labs were not tainted with other evidence, as it was different back then. Back in 1984, after Mark was arrested for escaping and being unlawfully at large, he was asked about Candace's case, but they didn't see him as a suspect. Now, Mark's girlfriend at the time was 14 years old, and let me remind you that he was a 21-year-old man, but she testified that she saw Candace coming out of a store shortly before she went missing. Her and Mark had been hiding out in an apartment by the store on Talbot Avenue at the time. When Candace disappeared, police never took a formal statement from Mark, as he was never a suspect, he was just on the run at the time. During the trial, a genetics professor had concerns that the mitochondrial DNA was bad science, as the lab had excluded data that may have resulted in false conclusions, even though results had a 1 in 50 million chance it would be another Caucasian male. On February 18, 2011, it took the jury 3 days to find Mark Grant guilty of second-degree murder, and in May 2011, during his sentencing hearing, his defense attorney mentioned that Mark had been sexually and physically abused growing up, and he had been a law-abiding citizen for the 18 months prior to his arrest. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, to which the judge had scolded him for showing, quote, unspeakable cruelty when he left Candace to die in the shed, unquote. During the preliminary hearing, a classmate of Candace's had testified that back in the day she was friends with Grant's ex-girlfriend, the 14-year-old that I previously mentioned. And so in 1988, when they were 17 and 18 years old, the girls had attended a house party, and during the house party, the topic of Candace's murder came up when Mark allegedly says, quote, I killed her, unquote. But a few minutes later, he says, quote, I didn't do it, I'm just kidding, unquote. Everyone at the party just kind of sat there stunned, not knowing if he was serious or not, because who in their right mind would joke about something like that? And allegedly, Mark and the girlfriend later showed up at her house threatening her to keep her mouth shut or they would do to her what they did to Candace. However, apparently the court was worried about this woman's credibility, and this could mean anything from previous drug abuse, alcohol abuse, being a sex worker, or having a history of lying, so the jury never got to hear this information. After the incident, the girlfriend had moved into the house beside hers, but she never did see Mark again, and this was enough to buy her silence until she was contacted in 2011. In June of 2011, Mark Grant filed an appeal citing 18 errors that were made in his case. In October of 2013, the Manitoba Court of Appeal ordered a new trial for Mark, as the other 12-year-old that was left tied up in a train car had many similarities happened when Mark was in jail. A retrial was scheduled for 2017, and it was a bench trial, meaning that the case was presented before a judge with no jury present. Now, because of the DNA discrepancies and possibility of tainted evidence, due to DNA being new and there being no official protocol on how to collect evidence, the police not handling the evidence with gloves, and scientists being unsure if the surfaces used to test were clean, the judge decides that Mark Grant is not guilty of Candace's murder, due to there not being enough evidence provided for proof without reasonable doubt. So I'm going to list the similarities in the two cases. First, Candace and Patricia were similar age. Candace was 13 and Patricia was 12. Both incidents occurred as the girls were walking home from school. They occurred on a Friday at the end of the school day. The distance between the shed that Candace's body was found in and the boxcar that Patricia was located in was about 2.6 kilometers. Both girls were left in a form of shelter. Both girls had their wrists and ankles bound using a granny knot. There was a lack of physical and sexual violence, There was Wrigley's gum wrappers found at both scenes, and Patricia was abducted 2 days before Candace Derksen's memorial. I will mention, though, that Patricia was not hogtied. Her ankles and wrists were bound separately, and the woman who found her said it was only wrapped around once or twice. When she was found, she was sitting up against the sidewall of the boxcar. Now, because of the slight differences in the cases, and Patricia being found not tied up tightly nor being hogtied, to me, this seems to be more of like a copycat. And is it possible that the second abduction was committed by someone close to the killer to throw off police because the murderer had an alibi of being behind bars for if they were to ever get caught? And so the slight differences, in my opinion, again, are huge, because somebody who was super into bondage and hog tying, I don't think they would find the thrill in sloppily tying up a female and leaving the possibility of her being able to break loose since her hands were free to reach her head and her feet. Let me know what you think. The family was heartbroken that Mark Grant was set free, and so her family really tried to move on. Her family has really accepted that there may never be an answer to who did this to Candace. And in November of 2018, her family opened Candace House near the courthouse. Its purpose is to allow families, victims, and survivors who have lost a loved one to a violent crime a safe and comforting home-like place to take a break during trials for the day. They assist families while navigating the court processes by providing emotional, social, and practical support, resources and referrals, as well as information about the justice systems and its processes. After the first trial, Candace's family and the search committee went on to build a swimming pool at a camp that Candace attended in the summer, and looked into starting a child find center right in Winnipeg. Candace's mother Wilma has since done so much for the community and other survivors. She has openly told her story and shared the heartbreak that she went through. One thing she mentioned was that the night that Candace was found, a man who had experienced the violent loss of his child had come over to the house and spoke with Wilma and Cliff. This man explained to them the gruesome details of the heartbreak and loss he had experienced after losing his child, like his job, his mental health, relationships, concentration, his ability to work, you name it. When he left, Cliff and Wilma were processing the horror and the truth that was about to come, but together they decided that they would respond differently, allow forgiveness, and change the world. Wilma has facilitated support groups for survivors of homicide, organized conversations between victims and inmates, conducted training and held lectures. She presented her insights to the justice system and addressed victims' needs at restorative justice conferences throughout Canada and the US. She is now a coach and a therapist, an instructor at life story writing, a pastor, and a published author. She remains a consultant for Manitoba Justice, for the Correction Services Canada, the RCMP, the Law Commission of Canada, and the Solicitor General. She's helped found numerous programs including Child Find Manitoba, Family Survivors of Homicide, Safe Justice Encounters, Voice of Resilience, Victim Companions, Candace House, and the Paying Forward Project. Cliff Derksen was a pastor and loved being outside. After Candace died, he started a successful janitorial service where he employed 17 staff members. And in 2010, he rented a studio space to express his healing journey through ceramic sculptures. He is well known in the area for his roped hand sculpture representing Candace's death. It is titled 7 Weeks. And he's also known for the feathered angel hands, titled Project Angel. Sadly, he passed away on May 22nd, 2022 at 76 years old. Now, this case is a little different and may never be closed due to the minimal evidence being left since there have been so many samples taken for testing. But maybe with the advancement of science in the many years to come, Candace's case could one day be closed. If you'd like to hear more in-depth about this case, her mother Wilma wrote a book called Have You Seen Candace?, which is an hour-by-hour account of what happened in the early days. And if you have any thoughts or insights about this case, I'd love to hear from you. You can follow me on Instagram at missing.murdered.macchiatos. I also have it linked in the description, and I post pictures weekly to go along with every episode. Please don't forget to like, follow, share with a bestie of yours so I can continue making content and spreading awareness about these cases, because we never know who is going to have the right information. Remember, every cup of coffee can be a moment of connection and conversation, so keep the discussions alive. Join me next week as we dive into another chilling tale, because the truth is often darker than we imagine. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and keep sipping. Bye for now.